Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I chose the topic of navigating Islamic discourse in the current era because, number one, I want to take advantage of the intellect and the scholarly work of Abou El Fadl, who's done tremendous work, which you will find in your program, on a number of topics and a number of ideas, and the books that he's written on Sharia and on the authoritarian and the authoritative as it relates to Hadith. I think these are must-reads by all of us and anyone that wants to take this work seriously. But I thought the key word is discourse. And in the first sessions, Khalid, there was a session about being able to look at munkar as something that is just not reasonable, not rational. That we are able to assess certain hadith and certain traditions in that way so that we can move forward into more relevant issues. There was another session about Islam as the inclusive religion or the inclusivity of Islam as opposed to the exclusivity of certain ideologies. And so I thought that you can take us to that level of where you see Islamic thinking or lack thereof and discourse on the issues, because I, for one, I don't know what kind of discourse there is among scholars. I know there's a need for discourse between scholars and activists. The brain and the muscle have to learn to work together to have a effective body. And there's definitely no discourse at the community level. We just come to the khutbahs, we hear the khutbahs, we usually fall asleep in the khutbahs, and then we go and complain about this or that afterwards. So there's definitely a need for discourse. So I'm going to let you present your remarks, and I hope, and I'm sure it will be much, it will be much to take from your thoughts, and then we're going to take it to our group of leaders. These are leaders from the Islamic Center, from New Horizon Schools, from MPAC, from the Bureau of Islamic and Arabic Education. So this is really the leadership, the people who are working for this movement. So I'm going to let you address them, and then we'll have a brief conversation. And I want you all to, you all have mentioned to me and to Adina and to Omar that there are issues that are being discussed in your schools and in the mosque that we're not ready to talk about. And so I want you to bring up those issues towards the end, and we'll go from there. So we have an hour and 40 minutes, inshallah, and we'll start with you. So first of all, thank you, Abou El Fadl, who's professor of Islamic law and a scholar at UCLA, and has studied with Shia scholars and other scholars, and in fact has received license or ijazah from the different schools of thought. So he has studied and taught at Princeton and other Ivy League schools, and now he's a professor of Islamic law at UCLA. So please give Professor Abou El Fadl.
Okay, thank you, Salam.
Oh, by the way, we also talked about how when we started at the Islamic Center, so you were also here 40 years ago.
Yeah, it came in 1982, when this podium used to be over there. Yeah. SubhanAllah, I mean, this room, I can't remember the number of times I've spoken in this room, and yesterday I was rummaging through some of my old notebooks and found some notes I've taken for talks, or notes that I've written down for talks at the Islamic Center.
Hold on, Khalid. Can you hear Khalid?
No.
Can you get the microphone close?
We're gonna.
Hello?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. We'll try to get a stand.
That's like singers.
Yeah.
Kiss the microphone. Not very sanitary though.
Islamic skills. Just a microphone.
Okay, well, kissing the microphone. Okay, so I was just reflecting on how often we've met in this room and spoken since 1982, and it's interesting always to compare, to take a look at your ideas over a span of time and to try to reflect on the type of issues and your perception of reality over decades. And now, like then, I am often, whenever I speak to especially Muslim leadership, and a group of people that occupy aspirational roles within the Muslim community, I'm always reminded of the Quranic revelation. We've sent you a book, كتاب أنزلنا إليك لتخرج الناس من الظلمات إلى النور. We've sent you a book so that you may bring forth people from darkness to light. And it is one of these foundational moral issues because we must struggle with and very carefully think about what role we play and whether in fact we are discharging this rather heavy and demanding, remarkably demanding imperative that we are able to think about what darkness is and what role we play in transformation of ourselves, first and foremost, but second, the way that we can assist other people to come forth from darkness to light. Now, of course, this assumes that we have a comfortable understanding of what darkness is, and that we have a comfortable understanding of what light is. And to be very blunt and honest, that we are entirely comfortable with how Islam in particular is needed to bring forth people from darkness to light. It is just a simple of a matter of rational thinking. If people can come forth from darkness to light without Islam, so if our role is simply ancillary, our role is that we play a function that doesn't exceed our own realities, then it seems that we are theologically and morally failing ourselves and failing our calling. But that's a heavy burden and a very serious one. It is not as simple as Muslims wanting to fit within a plurality of realities. But in fact, what I've called elsewhere, Muslims are charged with the obligation of moral piloting. So in fact, to be at the head of the curve morally and ethically, and to set an example unto others when it comes to ethics and morality, so that in fact we discharge this obligation of bringing humanity forth from darkness to light. Now, most of us, I mean, especially people who are swamped by the particularities and realities of life, their role is often going from one crisis to another and putting out one fire, from one fire to the next. And so there isn't a moment for a reflective pause where there is the possibility even of systematic and thorough thinking about what particular functions and roles we Muslims play in the trajectory of human history, and especially American Muslims, in this very demanding standard of, in fact, bringing forth people from darkness to light. Now, Islam, and here I'm going to bring my comments closer to the issue of Islam in the United States. But interestingly, since 1982, when I came to the Islamic Center, and I must say that when I remember these days, and remember first coming to the Islamic Center with Dr. Maher Hathout and his vision of what the Islamic Center would become and what role the Islamic Center, and especially seeing him talk about the Islamic Center in his travels in the Middle East, especially Egypt and the Gulf countries and so on. Back then, this was before the rise of Islamophobia. And the 1980s were an interesting transformative period in American history because this is the period in which the civil rights movement, the gist of the civil rights movement has worked itself out. There is a period where society is reflecting upon itself as a post-racial society, which now we know was completely a delusion. And there was the widespread embracing of the idea of the United States as a habitus for pluralist cultures and a multi-existing set of truth represented by the term pluralism. But it was also the rise at that moment, that juncture in history, was the rise of the neocon movement and the attempt to reclaim America as a Protestant, Christian, white civilization. Why do I say that? Because we are living in this moment. We are living in the byproduct of this moment. Post-racialism proved to be an illusion, and there is all over the Western world a re-emergence of nativism and racist ideology in ways that we have not seen since World War II, which is going to have numerous implications for us. What I want to underscore is that it is important to remember that Islam in the United States is not a new phenomenon. And by now, in the past decade or so, there have been several very good scholars who've written about the history of Islam in the United States, and we know that there were Muslim communities going back even to the 1600s, that in the Reconquista there were a number of Muslim conversos, in quote, meaning people who officially converted to Christianity, but upon coming to the United States reverted back to Islam and tried to create Muslim communities. There are some archaeologists who have excavated some of the earliest mosques in the United States going back to this period. We also know that about 30% of the slave population was Muslim. I can elaborate on this if you're interested in if you ask me questions about it, but I'll just go through the main stuff just to get to my point. We also know that part of the Western interaction with Islam in particular was the racialization of Muslims, and this is a very interesting and an important point, that through the long history between Islam and the West, there has been an insistence through Western history, through Christian Western history, to see Islam less as a religion and more as a racial phenomenon, represented, and especially the Arabization and Turkification of Islam, that Islam is particularly an Arab, Moorish, Turkish antithesis of the West. Basically, that Islam is a racial nemesis of the West. And that's an entirely invented category, because that little boogeyman invented in the Western imagination have often very little to do with any type of actually lived reality in Islam itself. But it doesn't matter, because you construct reality and you believe it and you deal with it. And part and parcel of that is that there has been consistent, even at the legal level, in all the state laws of antebellum America, a de-Islamizing of the slave population, the rejection of Islam among black Americans, so much so that it was imagined that if black Americans exhibited their Islam, then there was an assumption that there must be racially Moorish rather than real blacks, because it was not imagined that Islam could be anything but an Arab and Turkish and Moorish faith. Now, I should remind you that for a very long time, Muslims could not be citizens in the US. So it was only in the 1950s that the doors were opened for Muslims to become citizens. Okay. Why do I mention this? I mention this because, again, as I reflect on the entire movement, I can say that in 1982, which was a moment of optimism and a great aspirational moment and a decade of aspirations, I think it would be fair to say that we imagined that 20 years later, the reality of Islam and the reality of Muslim leadership would be largely consisting of a native American reality. And by Native American reality, I mean largely converts who take on the Islamic project as a pioneering project, speaking not from the point of view of an immigrant, first-generation immigrants, but speaking from the point of view of exactly thinking in terms of this paradigm of bringing forth people from darkness to light, because they themselves, as converts, have gone through that transformative process of, in the process of converting to Islam, have thought very deeply about coming forth from darkness to light. Sadly, in the intervening period from the 80s till today, and this colors our reality in the Islamic Center, no doubt. It colors it in attendance, it colors it in terms of how our children are, it colors it in terms of who we speak to and what our audience is made of the rise of Islamophobia as part of the neocon movement has become an all-embracing reality. Islamophobia is a very fascinating example of how racism can dissimulate its own discourse, how racism can articulate its racist premises, but in terms that camouflage the racial and ethnic premises. What was the impact of Islamophobia upon us? Well, numerous and overwhelming. I remember back in the 80s, and Salam has heard me say the same thing a gazillion times. Back when I would say to people, all the books being published on Islam are written by non-Muslims. We Muslims must make a difference in the book market. Publishers must care when they publish a book whether it's going to be read by Muslims. And of course, what I was identifying back then were the very first beginnings of the Islamophobic movement, the dedication of resources in the further alienation of Islam as an exotic and racial phenomena that is constructed as the nemesis of the West. The solution for me has always been in the convert population. If we are persuasive, if an immigrant community is persuasive to its adopted homeland, time and time again, whether we see it in India, whether we see it in China, whether we see it in Myanmar, whether in West Africa, the immigrant community, rather than assimilating in the culture in which it has created a new home, rather wins adherence from the native community so as to completely lose its ethnic and racial reality. So in other words, put differently, Islam in China becomes a thoroughly Chinese phenomenon, not because of assimilation, but because of conversions. Islam in Turkey, it was the Turkic ethnic element that made Islam what it is in Turkey, because Turks converted to Islam. Islam in Afghanistan, it was not the ethnic Arabs that continued to exist in Afghanistan and assimilated to Afghani culture. No, it was ethnic Afghanis who converted to Islam and became an Islamic phenomenon. You can use that example even in Myanmar. The reason that the genocide against the Rohingyas insists that they're Bengalis is that because in reality, they're not Bengalis. In reality, they had lost their ethnic composition a long time ago. They had become part and parcel of the fabric of society. And so when when you talk about the Rohingyas, those who try to invent an ethnic reality find it very difficult to do so. Again, think of, for instance, Bosnian Muslims. The Serbs wanted to insist that Bosnian Muslims were Turks and continued to be Turks. But the reality was Bosnian Muslims were no longer Turks. They were thoroughly European because of conversions. I remain convinced that the main challenge we confront is Islamophobia. Because Islamophobia intervened and disrupted our ability to win converts in our adopted homeland. And so we remained an immigrant phenomenon. Most of our leaders still were born, spent their formative years elsewhere other than the US. Many of our leaders still speak with a heavy accent. Most of our leaders have not felt that transformative moment of from darkness to light because we were born Muslim. And when you are born Muslim, it's a very different experience than the passion that comes from a convert, than the zeal that comes from a convert. Our response to Islamophobia has remained the response that sometimes among activists say academics is a bad word, but I'll use it. The response that academics monitor and study in many places throughout history. Our response to Islamophobia has been rather symptomatic, typical of colonized, subaltern people. What do these fancy words mean? Well, colonized people responded to Orientalism, which is the precursor to Islamophobia, responded to the co-optation of discourses about their own religion and their own culture. Remember, they're dominated by a colonizer. The colonizer is the superior. Even if there are natives that work for the colonizers, these natives are still proxies for the colonial powers. They still get their orders from London or Paris or whatever. And the response of colonized people to various forms of Orientalism, and not just among Muslims, but even look at what happened, for instance, for native cultures in South America, or what happened to native cultures in Africa, was always to go on the defensive in trying to match values with the colonizer. Meaning, the colonizer would say, we are here to civilize you, that's why we colonized you. We are here to civilize you, and for the colonized to simply go on the defensive and say, well, I already have that value that you want to preach for to. So their mode, and again, we study this throughout the colonial period, the response is reactive. It is always to take the rules of the game as defined by the colonizer, and then within these rules of that game that has been defined by the colonizer, to try to win incremental victories in that game by simply saying, I am not as bad as you say I am. And to often perform so that you earn credibility within the colonizer. Sadly, although the immigrant population in the U.S. and in the West generally is not they're not our grandparents who lived in a colonial reality, but our response to Islamophobia exhibited that same pattern. Instead of, in a very pragmatic, practical, pioneering fashion, investing money in the industry of information and deploying professionals, not part-timers, not extracurricular hobbyists, not people who are doing it on the side here and there, but coming to terms with the new science of communications and the science of lobbying and the science of data and information, and simply saying, okay, how much money are we going to invest in these institutions to counter that problem? like colonized people, we continue to hold on to the myth that only if they knew the truth about us, we can change their mind. So we explain Islam better. Let me tell you about the Prophet. Let me tell you about what's beautiful about religion, our religion. It doesn't work. If you are racialized, then the battlefield has already been defined in ways that you're talking about power dynamics. You're not talking about truth. Your oppressor, the Islamophobe, doesn't care what the facts are. And the Islamophobe will only respect people who can manipulate data and information, not an academic publication, not another professor publishing another learned study somewhere, but the modern science, the very modern science of data collection and dissemination, which is something that is remarkably complicated, and the deconstruction of racialization in itself. Put it simply, and I'll close with this. There's a lot more to say, but I don't want you to start falling asleep on me. And it might have already happened. I am convinced when I go back and I think of the very innocent and hopeful and dreamy conversations that I used to have with Dr. Maher, rahimahullah. Salam was always a part of these conversations because we would meet in coffee shops, and hang out drinking coffee till dawn, and talk about the movement. Remember? The movement. We would always talk about the movement. And I think it was I truly imagined that by the time I am in my 50s, that all the people that would be in attendance in the Islamic Center, at least 50% of the people would be converts. I remember specifically one conversation, and this was this is when what year was it that you were living in Irvine and I stayed?
86.
86 was that? Yeah. It was a conversation in 86, and it was I was staying at Salam's place, Irvine, and then that day I had spent time with Dr. Maher, and I told him, what would happen when I am in my 50s, and what would happen if the Jum'ah, we're talking about his khutbahs at Jum'ah, and whether people are asleep or awake during the khutbahs, and why are the khutbahs in most places so bad, and what can be done about it. I said, what do you think would happen if by the time I am in my 50s, most of the people attending Jum'ah are still immigrants? The answer he gave me then, we have failed. I actually, at the time, thought, that's not going to happen. Of course, when you're young, you're hopeful and you're cheerful and you're dreamy. And then you grow up and it all sucks. You start having pains everywhere. And your bones start falling apart. But I think the other point I want to close with is that Islamophobia, as a teacher, I encounter your children, basically, in college age, all the time. This is when they're away from home, and whether they talk to their parents or don't talk to their parents, you get to see them in their collegial habitat And the most nefarious thing about Islamophobia as a racist ideology is that it had sowed the seeds of doubt in the hearts of all of our children. And even, I would say, in even our hearts, because I encounter adults all the time who seem to want me to give them a response to things like, well, what do I say when they say the Prophet was a pedophile? Is it true that he had sex with a child? Is it true that he had slaves? And all these questions that show, that reveal an unsettled soul. Beyond this, Islamophobia has even infected long-term Muslim countries, because if you watch what the type of constructions, use a polite word, that are coming out of countries like Egypt or Saudi or Immigrant, you realize that the elite has become affected by Islamophobia even in Muslim countries. My only, in thinking for so long about this, I continue to be convinced that the paradigm changer, the thing that would flip the table on its head, is if we get our act together, deal with a professional world in a professional manner. The days of a Renaissance man, where someone is an engineer and a doctor and a jurist and a philosopher and a musician and an artist, are over. Our world is the world of specialists and the world of specialization. That simply the generation of data and information has become too enormous for hobbyists to be effective or impactful. And we need that, because we need to be more effective in getting that simple message of why is it that we can bring people forth from darkness to light. And we're not going to be very effective at doing that until the people who articulate this paradigm shift are converts, not immigrants. Okay, let me stop here.
Well, we'll go right to you first. Marwa.
So okay. I think I definitely agree with the idea that we sort of need to sow the seeds of Islam within the soil of the United States. But I think that, you live in a beautiful house and you have a garden, and people drive by and see how beautiful your garden is, and that would be Islam's appearance to the outside world. But you walk into the house and it's falling apart. Our youth are being impacted not just by Islamophobia, they're being impacted by us. We're not addressing their needs, we're not addressing their issues. We, brush things under the rug, and I think until we are able to truly hear them, they are gonna leave. They're gonna leave Islam. It's not even about a convert, it's about our own children who were born Muslim no longer practicing. So that is the main concern that I'm seeing. I'm seeing it with my kids, I'm seeing it in the schools where they're saying, oh, I have a friend whose dad used to be Muslim, they're not Muslim. It's almost like a genetic rather than a religious affiliation.
Yes, over here. I'm sorry, your name?
Yusuf?
Yusuf.
Bismillah.
First, I'd like to say thank you, Jazakallah khair, for starting this discourse. I think more spaces need to be had like this for us to truly address the issue. I'm speaking as someone who converted to Islam 6 years ago, from a Mexican-American background. When you chose that ayah, it really resonated with me because I truly know how darkness is without Islam. Like, I could define that by actually knowing like what the other side is, and it's a blessing I hope I don't take for granted. My wife is a convert. We're the first Muslims in our family, and I hope that I could teach and pass on this religion to my children, and it stay in my lineage till the day of judgment. It's very important, and it's something I've been developing my 6 years into Islam, on how to reconcile who I am as a Muslim, and it's in a context in America where I think a lot of people do not know who they are. The colonization has breeded a ahistorical mindset, and it's still here in this country for people that are native born here. And you bringing up culture and embracing Islam, I'm still developing it, and I recently just read a paper by Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah, The Cultural Imperative of Islam, and how Islam flourished in so many different lands where people embrace it. And he uses a beautiful analogy where Islam is like water, and you should see the beautiful waterbed below it. So when it went to China, you still see it's Chinese, but Islam is like a purification, but their culture is still there, that's the waterbed. And it's something I'm learning to navigate as an American, as someone from a Mexican background. And it's something I don't think we're truly addressing. We're truly reaching out to people. And I think this Islamic Center, and this is why I'm part of the board here, and please make dua for me because I don't think I'm doing that good of a job. But I think this Islamic Center, because there is a space here where people feel comfortable coming in. And my wife and I felt comfortable enough to attend a class with Sheikh Asim, and we learned. We grew with others, but many people who were in that class aren't coming here anymore. And we need spaces to reach out to the converts. I was at a point after embracing Islam within my first year is like, what did I just do? Like, is this something I don't understand completely still, and I don't know how to navigate through so much. And I think part of the issue is just having foundational knowledge. Something that I've really grown with is understanding traditional Islam and taking principles from it. And I'm someone who follows a madhab, the Maliki madhab. I'm learning Aqidah, but it's not as like, oh, the hadith says this. There's principles that we take from it, and there's context and understanding the hadith. And not to throw, and I've learned too the importance of having teachers. And there's a hadith that says the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. And there's valid, not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as far as, because I'm not equipped to understand this religion completely. I don't know Arabic. I don't know the tools in understanding hadith. I don't understand the Quran, but I want to learn those skills. And I think there's an educational gap that needs to be filled. I think there's a cultural bridge that we need to build, and we need to develop Islamic American culture, as well as acknowledging we're a country with many different cultures, and it's going to have subgroups in it. I think we need education, and I think we also need to be just as critical of liberalism and progressivism, and not to match our values, like you said, as the colonizer, because I think we're in a more dominant, even though there has been an influx of nativism, liberalism and progressivism is something that still is a dominant ideology in the country. And we have principles too that aren't exactly lined up completely with it, and we have to be just as critical of that too. I think I have one more point. Well, if I come back, I hope. Yeah.
How about others talk, and then we can come back.
Yeah. I'm saying this from a passionate perspective because there's a real issue of people leaving Islam. We talk about it being the fastest growing religion, but it's because a lot of immigrants are having children. And there's a lot of people I know who have embraced Islam who are not Muslim anymore.
Right.
So I want us to really think about those things.
Right. And I think Marwa also brought up the issue of children. You brought up a number of points, And at some point, Khalid, I want you to talk about this idea. What is an American Islamic culture? I mean, you mentioned Turkey and I forgot what other countries, China, but those cultures are by and large homogenous. So we're in a heterogeneous society here. So what does an American Islamic culture look like, or what's the thinking behind an American Islamic culture? So we'll come back to your points. We'll take one more comment and then we'll let Khalid respond to these points. We'll do 3 at a time, and then after that I saw Megdi and some others, and Hala. We'll do round 2 with them. Yes, you're next.
Assalamualaikum.
Your name?
Mildred.
Mildred, yeah.
I too am a convert since 2009. My parents are Guatemalan immigrants, and I grew up in the ghettos of LA. So I know, as he said, the other side, and I've had contemplated all my life the idea of what you call now darkness. I grew up Catholic. I never prayed to Jesus, I can say, but I would pray to God, and nobody said that to me. It just never made sense. But then when I found Islam in my college years, it just clicked. And I think God led me through my own evolution. As the brother said, the path is wide, and there's all roads lead to Rome, as they say, but all the roads are different, and the obstacles we face are different. But one thing that I faced as an issue when I converted to Islam is, who do I turn to? My parents weren't accepting, so it's difficult. And I didn't come to the Islamic Center, if I'm being blunt, it's because I thought they had ties to the government, meaning like, where they get their funding. I wasn't aware. So I did use a lot of their tutorials that they had back then on how to pray. I didn't know how to pray. And so ICSC taught me how to pray, essentially. But then when I met Muslims and as the years progressed, I found that there was not only, there was this barrier between ethnicities, and I even see it now when I speak to certain people. I say, oh, what mosque do you go to? Oh, I go to the Bengali mosque. I go to the Indonesian mosque. And I thought it would be different. I thought it would be, we're an ummah, we don't divide ourselves. We're proud of our heritage, but at the same time, we're just Muslim. And people always tell me, why don't you go to the Hispanic masjid? I think there's one over here. And I tell myself, why do I want to go there if I'm only going to be around Hispanics, as they say? And so I think that's one major obstacle that, if as a convert, I can see that I face currently. Also, that's why I came to New Horizons School of Los Angeles, to put my children in the school and try to cultivate this aspect that's new to me as well, and I'm learning with them at the same time. And I think another obstacle is when you kind of touched upon what these Muslim countries are facing, this Islamophobia. I think it's also, and I find immigrants, they come here and they want to aspire to the American dream, although that American dream is slowly morphing. I think it's like a globalization that's affecting the whole world, because they are the ones in power, and so they give the rules, and you either play by the rules or you don't, but if you don't, you're not part of the majority. And I feel that now Muslims come here, and they, from Muslim countries, and also within those Muslim countries, they get into NAFTA and all these trade agreements, and you have to play by the rules, and you have to conform to their rules, otherwise, and sometimes that compromises our own Muslim values, you can say. So I think globalization is also a major issue that many don't realize or question or criticize or critically think about. And yeah, that's all I have to say.
Respond to these points first.
I mean, I'm not sure that I have as much of a response, perhaps just reflections. The issue of attrition rates is extremely alarming. I want to say, excuse me, a few years ago I actually did some research trying to track down who is it that said that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. The reason I did that is that, I mean, that's an empirical claim, and I wanted to know what is the data behind that empirical claim. And make a long story short, there is no data behind it. The claim was made first, the first group of people to make that claim was Bernard Lewis and his students. And so it seems, and interestingly, it was made at the time that Christianity, especially Catholicism, but also Protestant missionaries, were spreading in the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, of course. So in other words, if you look at the map of the world, China was not a Christian country. Now it is. Japan wasn't a Christian country. South Korea wasn't. What is very interesting is that while we were told that Islam is the fastest growing religion, the actual people who were spreading their religion on the ground was Catholics and Protestant missionaries, not Muslims. In fact, Muslims tend to be apologetic about missionary work. We're not like the Mormons, where all of our kids expect to go on missionary work, right? For a year or two or whatever. It is considered something not good on your resume when you say, I've gone and done missionary work in Africa or in China, if you're Christian. But for a Muslim, it's even unheard of. Most parents would freak out if their kids told them, we want to go do missionary work. That is part of that paradigm transformation that you can see between a convert and an immigrant. An immigrant is apologetic about the idea of doing missionary work because all the immigrant wants to do is be accepted. Just give me a piece of the pie, I'll play nice. A convert it grows up with a very different state of mind. And now add to this the attrition rates. The attrition, and this is why I started out by saying that Islam is not a new phenomenon in the US, because the Muslim populations that have immigrated to the US in the 1930s, there was a sizable number of people from Lebanon and Yemen, Muslims from India. Successive generations disappeared. And when I try to search for what is it that can you identify constant factors that leads to success or failures? And the only thing that I can see consistently there is that immigrant religiosity tends to coalesce around cultural paradigms, not ideological paradigms. So, in other words, they want to have a piece of back home where they are. Well, having a piece of back home doesn't continue being convincing to your children, especially if you come from a colonized culture, because a colonized culture is not cool. So, for instance, if you're an immigrant Italian, continuing having a piece of back home could be cool for your children. I'm Italian, I go eat spaghetti and do whatever Italians do, I don't know, say a few Italian words, have the Italian family. It's mythologized as something cool and attractive and survivable. But if you come from an Arab, Indo-Pak, Turkish cultural paradigm, it's not mythologized as something cool, it's actually mythologized as something backwards and retarded. And in turn, your children who grow up in this country have the same prejudices that all white, whatever the white race is, because that's a big question, who is actually white. But whatever dominant cultural paradigms teach about colonized cultures. This is not just for Arabs or for Turks or but also for instance for Native Americans. Native Americans have had the hardest time maintaining the culture because as a dominated colonized people, they have a very hard time convincing their children that their culture can be attractive or cool. That's why most of our children grow up, they hide their cultural uniqueness. They don't exhibit it or display it. What does seem to have staying power is ideology instead of culture. It's actually, and so if you compare anthropological studies on children of converts compared to children of immigrants, the children of converts have a far higher rate of retention of Islamicity than children of immigrants. And it's very interesting. Converts are far more successful in keeping their children Muslim than immigrants are. Part of it is as immigrants, take a very simple example. The way I learned the seerah of the Prophet it was good enough for me. But if I teach my children about the life of the Prophet the way I learned it, which is basically the da'wah in Mecca, the hijrah, and then the Medina period, which are, Uhud, Badr, Uhud, etc., all the battles, it's alienating to them, thoroughly alienating to them. They will gain nothing, absolutely nothing from it. Now, if I exercise my intellect, and that's why you need specialists, but you need to know how to invest in the right specialists, not just any specialist. If you study the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, and you realize that these battles where the prototypical what's the name of Disney? Not Disney. The people who do all those hero movies, Batman, Superman, Marvel type. It's a prototypical heroic character, the freedom fighter that fights for liberty. And that what is far more important are not the battles, but the series of humanistic stands that the Prophet took vis-a-vis racially oppressed people, economically disadvantaged people, the arrogance of the Meccan aristocracy, and you reformulate the seerah where basically your kid, for instance, studies the seerah where they hardly even know the names of the battle. But they know the names of so many of these moralistic stands. You could have a paradigm shifter, but it requires, time and time I've heard the seerah of the Prophet by immigrants, and regardless of how much they try to make it relevant, they don't have the knowledge base because most of them are hobbyists. They're just doing it as extracurricular activity. They don't have the time or the energy or the knowledge to sit there and dedicate 10 years of their life studying everything so that they can retell the story in a way that can make sense to our children in this reality. This is why I don't know how many times I've stood here and I begged I don't know who I'm begging, quite frankly. Sometimes I feel like I'm just begging
The wall.
the wall, the ghosts, the phantoms in the room, because it's you know what the vision is, but you don't know who the heck can help you achieve that vision. I know that I'm not good in convincing rich people to back me up. That I know. I don't seem to. Rich people don't like me. Alhamdulillah. And so fine, they back up whatever but we have a serious issue. The other thing I do want to address is this issue of white culture, and because you raised a really important point. Islam, from the time of the message of the Prophet ﷺ, to the way that it spread in Africa, the way it spread in China, what fascinates me is that Islam was always the most appealing, not to the aristocracy of any homeland in which it entered, but actually to the disempowered element in society. Islam was always, with its message of egalitarianism, its message of anti-racism, its message of rebellion against inherited cultural entitlements, always appealed to the most disempowered elements in society, and was always embraced and always threatened the elite within societies. And so time and even Islam among African Americans, there's a wonderful article by a guy called Michael Curtis about how the early 1900s and the spread of Islam among African Americans, and how the white elite started seeing Islam as a revolutionary threat, which, by the way, is very consistent with the way people have always worried about the ideology of jihad. And jihad, not necessarily violence. I mean, I'm talking about ideology of jihad, that lighting a fire under people that makes them say, we resist oppression wherever it may exist. So it is, at the same time, you're absolutely right. Immigrants have a very different outlook. And again, I'm an immigrant, so in part I'm confessing like a Catholic, right? You just have to give me, you have to just absolve me of my sins and so. Immigrants, their psychological orientation is to want acceptance. That is their highest. It's just to find, not even necessarily assimilation, but to prove to their inhabited homeland that they're not bad, and just make way for me, make space for me. Now, institutionally, structurally, this is reinforced with a threat, is that if you don't play good, you don't naturalize, or sometimes if you adopt the wrong ideological positions, you could find yourself in denaturalization and deportation proceedings. A lot of immigrants will even join or sons of immigrants will join the military to prove their fidelity and loyalty. It's a very different outlook than those who come to Islam to resist subordination and see American military adventurism as unfair and unjust wars around the world, and thus oppose them. That's something that has to be a part of our conversation, and we have to be honest about it, and honest about acknowledging it, and honest about seeing if it's possible to build bridges. Because I've noticed that a lot of converts stop coming to Islamic centers where immigrants dominate because they find the discourse very alienating. You know, you guys are just want to be white. That's really all you aspire for. I don't, as a convert.
Okay, Mehdi, Hala, then Halima. Shad. Okay, we'll go for 4 this time.
Okay. Dr. Khalid, you...
And I've been told by Dina to try to get into more of the current issues
Yeah, well, I think this is
going on in your institution.
because you touched upon the American Muslim dream in the 80s, and in your book about reasoning with God, there was a whole section about that American dreams, and in some of the examples that you gave, although you didn't mention the Islamic Center, clearly it was obvious you were referring to it. My question to you is, do you think that that American Muslim dream is dead, or it has manifested itself in ways that we did not expect? I kind of feel that the dream is still alive. Again, there is attrition. There are things that didn't happen that we hope that it will happen. But on the overall, I feel that the American dream is still alive. It just, we have to kind of maybe change our strategy to achieve things that were not achieved, you know, following the strategies that we follow.
Thank you. Hala, and thank you for being succinct. You can...
I want to thank you very much for your reflections, and in particular this discussion about the immigrant versus the convert experience. And in very simple terms, I think with every burden there is relief, and this Islamophobia is definitely a difficult time, but offers us the challenge of, I think, 2 elements that could help move us forward in a movement at the Islamic Center, which is the best place. I think we're very lucky and blessed to be in this environment. 2 things, education and service. And while we don't want to be missionaries, I think if each one of us, immigrant or convert, comes with our children, our new generation, and serves as a purpose in our religion, I think that, with minimal education, and that could really make a big difference in moving forward.
Thank you, Hala. Halima?
So my point was, I think, I understand where you're coming from, but I think to fix the issues, we ourselves need to change. I think what's happening is that we're not practicing Islam like we should. We're not following the Prophet like we should. And the reason we feel like there's no zeal, because there's a lot of people out there. You know, if you revert to Islam, if you've forgotten your religion, you come back, all these people become all zealous all of a sudden. And I don't want to be, I'm not saying zealousness, but I think if just coming back to the religion and fixing ourselves first is a way to fix society outside. Because if we are the best example, people will automatically follow. I don't think you can, if we can't improve ourselves, I don't think we can improve the world around us.
Thank you. Shabbat?
As someone that was born and raised in the U.S., I think, we spoke about converts, we spoke about immigrants, and someone, growing up here, initially, we're following Islam and stuff, but a lot of what we see is cultural, like what you were saying. So I don't think that it's, for someone that's a convert that, they're already older, so they're making the active choice. But for our children that are going to be born and raised here, they're already fighting against Islamophobia, whether it's like with Valentino's ghost and, active issues that are going on for us to question ourselves. So our children are growing up questioning themselves. So I think to increase the zeal, we have to look at our children. We have to give them that knowledge base. We have to give them a relevant Islam, not focus so much on a lot of minor details, but the broader picture, to see the forest through the trees, for them to appreciate and love our religion. I mean, not everyone is fortunate to be able to go to Muslim schools. Alhamdulillah, I'm part of this community so our children can go here. Because you want your children to not have to defend who they are when they're still trying to figure themselves out. So I think our future is with our children, and for us to help give them the hope that, to understand our religion and the beauty of it, so then if someone comes with questions, they can say, no, that's not my religion, that's just some crazy folk. But I think that's where we have to focus too, not just putting all of our hope in, it's either, one group or the other, I think.
Thank you. Okay, why don't you reflect on it? No. We have to go round one first, then we'll come back to you.
I was going to take Chairman's prerogative.
No, sorry, not here. So go ahead and reflect, and then Omar, Iqbal, Levent are next, and then we go back to Yusuf for round two.
Well, I think that the critical thing...
Kiss the microphone.
Oh. The critical thing is, I completely agree that our children are a priority. How can you possibly even think about hoping for converts if they're not going to be ambassadors for that process of persuading the wider base of the beauty of Islam? The thing, though, is that one of the important things that I often think about is that we want to teach our children something beautiful. But it really takes, and we want to tell our children something beyond, because our children will say, well, in what ways is Islam special? And that's always the sort of the real challenge. In other words, well, if I am just a good person and have good values, what does Islam add to me? Why do I need to be a Muslim? Most of the people that say, my parents used to be Muslim or so on, they always come at it from the angle of, well, if you're just a good human being and you just believe in a God and you worship God in your own way, okay, so khalas, that's good enough. And so the real challenge as a parent is that to be able to say, no, this is why you need to do it per Islam way, not, the shahada, the praying, the fasting, the zakah, the Quran, the sunnah. And, when we are completely honest, that's where the challenge is. Because coming up with a response to our children when they say, well, why can't we just be a good person and believe in a God and so on? And it takes, the most valuable thing that humanity possesses, and this, subhanAllah, that our Prophet Salam taught us this centuries ago, when the Prophet says that Allah has not created something weightier in the mizan, in the scale, than the intellect, and that the single intellect in a single moment of reflection is worth 1,000 prayers. It was teaching us what we actually need to remember now, that the production of an intellect. So in other words, for me to teach my child, why is it that we need the Islamic practice as opposed to the Jewish practice or the Christian practice or no practice or Tai Ching or Taoist Buddhism or all the cool stuff that all the new age religions that is produced. I need to rely on intellects that I get my ammunition and backup from. And if the intellectual milieu is missing, in other words, if there is a poverty of ideas, I don't know how to answer my child. If you try to actually if we sit together in a circle and say, okay, let's try out giving responses. Let's brainstorm at what type of responses would be persuasive. New age religion, basically do as you will, as long as you're a good person and worship a god, acknowledge some superior higher power, versus Islam, prayer, fasting, and so on. And then we try it out by bringing a bunch of kids give them a truth serum, and they vote on whether they found our responses persuasive or not. The results of that experiment, I think, would be very interesting. That is the standard we need to set for ourselves. We need to be honest as to whether we are able to produce persuasive responses to our children. And we need to allow empirical sociological reality to speak truth to us. So if statistically we are finding that our children go to college and behind our backs stop praying and stop fasting, start dating and drinking, and hide it from us, then that truth, we must allow that truth to speak to us. And that truth must then challenge us to come up with something better, because then we're not doing a good job. There's a certain furious moral inventory that those of us that take a position of leadership, whether we want to or not, in other words, we occupy some exemplary role, we must be rather brutal in taking a moral inventory, even if we don't disclose everything to our children, even if we are conscientious about what we admit in public or not. I mean, the way I speak in non-Muslim audiences is very different than the way I speak to Muslim audiences. But when it comes to speaking with you, I must be remarkably honest and extremely conscientious, because this is home base, right?
And to make this question on the American Muslim dream, between 1 and 10, 1 is obsolescence and 10 is metaphysical certainty. Where are we in that?
I don't know. I mean, it's not obsolete, of course. It is. I'm just worried that when I read the history of Islam in the United States, it worries me, because by the third generation, the mosques get abandoned and the population disappears when it comes to immigrants. And this happened in the beginning of the 20th century, it happened in the 1950s and 1960s, and the Islam that survives becomes a very cultural Islam. In other words, you have Persian segment of the town, the Arab segment, even Lebanese segment of the town, Egyptian segment of the town, Yemeni segment of the town, and so on. In other words, the religion becomes acculturated, and it reduces itself to a set of clothes and foods and smells, and rather than a vibrant, lively faith. So that's what worries me. That's what concerns me. The New Age religion phenomena in post-modernity, in postmodern culture, and this goes back to that point about liberalism and progressivism. Yes, being progressive is a cool thing. It sounds cool. But it's also very dangerous, because once you've accepted the premises of progressive liberalism, you quickly end up with feel-good individualism that accepts a higher power but rejects the very philosophical premises for any established institutional set of laws that regulate religious practice. And that's why, you know, when you look at further generations, you find that even when they say they're Muslim, they're sort of like, you know, you guys saw this article about liberal Islam.
Creeping liberalism.
Creeping liberalism.
New York Times.
And you know, when you get people like that say, oh, well, I'm Muslim, but it's okay to drink and it's okay to sleep around and have extramarital sex and we don't really need marriage, and you know, for the type of Islam I no longer recognize and I don't want. But you have to be, you know, progressive liberalism is like playing with fire. If you're not very good, it's going to burn you. And being very good means being a philosopher. If you're just an activist and you don't read a lot of philosophy, be very careful how you use language like progressive liberalism. It will explode in your face.
Omar, Iqbal, Yusuf, and then Levent, and I think that will wrap it up for the day.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So, if the topic of this section of this segment is navigating Islamic discourse in the current era, I'm hearing that the current era is our kids and the issues with their adherence to faith. I'm hearing that we are dealing with converts from various backgrounds and the perspectives they bring, but not only that is the isolationism that they feel when they come to the faith. I'm hearing that we have immigrants with a colonized mentality and the need to be accepted by the white man, if you will. I'm hearing that we have to deal with liberalism and the dangers of progressivism. That's the sum of what defines what I'm hearing and what the era is, which, as I think about that, how do we as institutions try and design for each one of those? I don't think we can. I don't think we want to. I think we want, I pick up on something that Dr. Khalid said, which is that they all have to come into a milieu, into an ideological base at some point. And by the way, I am, you know, I'm optimistic actually. I think there is great opportunity. The challenge will be is getting the resources to do so. And what I personally am hoping for is guidance from the intellectual community. For those of us, the people in the audience here are the worker bees, if you will. Here, sort of doing the daily work, if you will, in the various facets of schools and, you know, political activism, community activism, etc. I think what I would be interested in is what can the academic world advise those of us who are working on what you need to be cautious of, what you need to be thinking about, what you need to be anticipating. And I know it's a little bit off subject, but I think this is what the current era is. I'm looking for some help and guidance, let me put it that way.
All right, Iqbal?
My question is the following. You gave examples of Muslims coming into Turkey and so forth, or in other parts of the world, China, whatever it may be. Is our experiment in the United States just so new that we're just part of a large social integration that sounds like historically has taken place since Islam came about? We're having these problems because the term Islamophobia came around in the 2000s, I guess. I don't know, maybe it was prior to that even too. But, you know, that's what we're afraid of. So if these are the issues that have taken place historically, and we're just 30 years, or what is it, 2000 to 2018, 20 years into this experiment, are we sort of, I'm not saying take a complacency position, but isn't there part of a logical transition of us into the social mainframe of a place where we're still a minority? Number one. And number two, when I came here when I was 4 years old. There were no Muslims in the city of Pico Rivera, as far as I know. I was probably the only kid that was there that was Muslim. My parents never really forced me to follow Islamic practices. But as I grew older and watched them and sort of modeled after my parents and came into realizations of the importance of religion and so forth, other than praying 5 times a day, I pretty much do everything else that I'm supposed to. So I just, kind of listening to the whole thing and reflecting on what you've said, I think there's just a part of us that is going to go through integration of Muslims into what you call the American dream. If I fell off the face of this earth tomorrow, I think I lived the American Muslim dream. I got to practice my religion. I raised a family. I raised kids. No one ever told me I couldn't do something or I could do something based on my faith. So I don't know what the American dream really is, of the American Muslim dream, but I think I'm living it.
So I'll make it shorter. I guess the point that I didn't make that came to my realization was, where is the role, and I want to frame this as a question because this is a discourse and I want to continue more than just a rant. Where is the role of spirituality in all of this? Whether it's our philosophy, and we had 3 aspects, and it had a lot to do with the intellect. But where is the role of spirituality as we practice our Islam? And a source of spirituality are the best of all creation, the Prophet ﷺ. And really loving him, our love towards him, and modeling that, because he was sent just to perfect character. And knowing those stories is something that's just helped me in my understanding of traditional Islam, the aspect of tasawwuf. And though I said I'm Maliki, I'm not promoting any particular madhab or any particular aqidah view or tariqah, but these are avenues I've found growth in different aspects of my life. And where is the role for teaching the manners, teaching stories like when Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, when he was spit on in the battlefield and he was about to kill someone, he just walked away because he said, if I would have killed him, I would have killed him for myself and not for the sake of Allah. These stories that teach us the spiritual character, where's spirituality, manners, and our relationship to the Prophet, his family, his companions, the mothers of the believers, as we grow and Islam develops in America.
Thank you. And Levette, clean up.
Okay, so I'm wondering about the immigrant, the first, second, third generations. Could they have the paradigm of conversion, like when they come to their own epiphany of faith, which may be distinctly different than their parents? And I think the Quran always warns us that we should not just follow the way of our fathers. So that's the one thing about the epiphany of faith, is what I think is the criteria there that children of immigrants can have and add to that energy for the convert. And the second thing is about the American Muslim identity. I've never known, or my personal observation is that very few converts relate to that, and very few of my children's generation who have an epiphany of faith, they don't really relate to that. So has the American Muslim identity ran its course?
That's it. Yes, Grace?
A quick comment?
Yes? Oh, can you give Grace a microphone?
Okay, so I've been a convert 25 years yesterday, and I'm Professor Wakal's wife. Thank you. And all of these issues we talk about at the Usul Institute, so I just want to give a plug for the things that we do there. But I just wanted to comment. When people talk about American Muslim identity, I grew up here in America. My parents were Taiwanese immigrants, and I consider myself fully American in that, I come at it with, I have a right to do what I want, to do what I believe. And I get frustrated when I hear people talk about just an identity, because I think being Muslim is about a conviction, and it's about what you do, and it's not, what you wear. Obviously, people, make comments about well, why doesn't she wear hijab or whatever. I think we're missing the point. It's about what we feel passionate about in terms of how we live our lives, what we are convicted about, and what that means in terms of our belief. What does God want us to do? And that is, universal for everyone. So.
Thank you.
All of these are such important comments, and so I guess I have to pick and choose what I'll reflect on. First, I want to say that the language American dream or Muslim American dream is not mine. I didn't use it in my talk, and I don't use it in my writings, and I'm very critical and skeptical of the expression, the American dream, because the history of that expression is marred with the reality of slavery and racism, and the American dream was always a very superficial camouflage for the white establishment and the role of America as a white nation. And it's interesting because it's America as a melting pot in itself. Part of what most converts, I think, are very attuned to, and most immigrants are not attuned to, is the very prominent role of racism in American history. There are reasons for that. They're not in the genes. There are historical reasons for that. But one of our main challenges as Americans is to overcome the embedded institutional role, the structural role of racism in our history and in our institutions. And we are not, our ethnic configuration in the U.S. didn't happen naturally. It's not that Europeans naturally were the predominant number of people who immigrated to the U.S. It was engineered legally to be so. For 150 years, only whites could become U.S. citizens, and if you were not white, there were severe quotas as how many non-whites could immigrate to the U.S., while there were basically open doors for whites. So I don't use language like the American dream and stuff like that. The other thing is that when, I'm not sure how to react when someone says, well, if I'm living the American dream, well, I guess, good for you. I mean, I'm happy for you. I'm not sure what the American dream is, and I'm not sure if what I'm living I'm very happy with, because the way I perceive things, it's part and parcel of the way I understand the world and the patterns of globalization. The world is becoming an increasingly oppressive and unfair place where capital and wealth is becoming increasingly monopolized by particular races. You want to see something extremely powerfully symbolic? Look at the impotence of Muslims with the loss of Jerusalem. Would have been imaginable in the 80s? If you're a Muslim, and even I find Muslims that try to philosophize the loss of Jerusalem is somehow okay. Look at what happened to Mecca and the impotence in Muslims in making any difference. The commercialization and obscene capitalism of that now marks the site of the Holy Prophet the tall high-rise buildings, the Uncle Ben, the fast food joints, which if you care about the Sunnah, you would be deeply troubled, because so much of it is against exactly what the Prophet and the companions taught. So, I mean, it is very difficult but again, this demonstrates that issue that I'm talking about. An immigrant often is happy if they simply are allowed to exist and to have an individually thriving life, to raise their family, to have a good job, to pay their bills. That is typically how an immigrant is happy. That is not how converts are happy, or immigrants reborn, or new immigrants that sort of born again Muslims, or then immigrants like me who live with books and spend all the time reading about history and anthropology and sociology and things like that. You know, but these are. The other thing that I want to comment on is what Omar Rishi brought up. It is really important to keep in mind an educated activist is a value in and of itself. We often adopt the wrong paradigm in that we want academics to give us, to chart a pathways. Often as activists, we're organizers and we're administrators, and we want a schedule, and we want you go from point A to point B to point C. The role of academics is to elevate the way we perceive the world, to contribute to our general notion of education. In other words, to allow us to become as activists more sophisticated with a deeper understanding of, so that we're not just dealing with reality as we perceive it to be, but reality as has been studied by others. I mean, if I had a magical wand and I could make whatever I want occur, I would give top priority to investing an enormous amount of resources in responding to Islamophobia, first and foremost, because I have spent a great deal of time tracing how far Islamophobia has affected not just the rate of conversion to Islam, but the attrition among our children. In my studies, I have found that the type of doubts raised by Islamophobes about Islam, and Islamophobia is not an entirely new phenomenon, it is the old Orientalism, but the old Orientalism has created the phenomena of a-religious secularists in Muslim countries. Old Orientalism created Ataturk and his national secularism, created Abdul Nasser, created Saddam Hussein, created Assad. What more destruction do you want than that? I mean, if you think Orientalism hasn't made a difference, yes, it did. It created the boogeymans that destroyed the Islamic civilization. And now, in its new manifestation of Islamophobia, it makes our children ashamed of saying they're Muslim. When I came to the United States, we used to go to a park and we used to proudly pray Jama'ah, and you remember that because Maher was with us, and we would proudly pray Jama'ah as part of doing dawah. We would all line up and pray in a park, and when and Maher would say, if anyone comes up and say, what are you doing? This is your time to educate them about Islam. This is unthinkable today. Unthinkable today. And it's unthinkable because of Islamophobia. And Islamophobia is not a natural organic movement. It is an industry. Read about it, because there are people that sat down, planned, plotted, organized, raised funds, and created the industry of Islamophobia. And the only way you can respond to it is not by going to an already overburdened, overworked, overtaxed teacher and saying, you should know how to respond to all the charges that Islamophobes bring up about Islam, because it's impossible. You can't answer these things through what's the word I'm looking for? Sound bites. You can't answer them. Thank you. You can't answer them through sound bites. You need a counter industry. And you can only have a counter industry if we have the funds. So if I had a magical wand, I would get the funds, I would get rich people to pay up. Rich people, stop buying cars and homes and taking care of your children. You need to take care of Islam. And I would find people whose specialty are communications and the science of information. And I would create institutions to counter Islamophobia. That would be my first priority. And then the other priorities would start coming in. I was around Princeton when Bernard Lewis was around, and back then, Bernard, I went through graduate school at Princeton by keeping my mouth shut all the time. I rarely spoke. That's how Bernard Lewis people became convinced that I was one of these weak Egyptian Muslims that, their dream in the world is to get a tenured position somewhere, and he hired me as his assistant, and then later on hired me as the managing editor of his journal. And hanging around Bernard Lewis, I happened to be present in the conversation between him and Daniel Pipes, setting up the Annenberg Institute that sparked the flame of Islamophobia. And I also happened to be present when Bernard Lewis was explaining to his friends why he wrote his book about Islam and slavery, because he was worried about the rate of conversions to Islam by black Muslims, and he wanted to convince them that the institution of slavery was invented or furthered by Arabs and Muslims. If you go today, back then, back in the 80s, everyone took it for granted that Islam is against slavery. You go today and put on Google, Islam and slavery. You want to see the effects of Islamophobia? The first few entries will be the role of Muslims in perpetuating and furthering slavery. You'll find tons of articles that blame Muslims for the institution of slavery. That's Islamophobia. And you need professionals to respond. Not me, not you. And we need resources to do so. Did I say everything?
You did. Thank you so much. We're out of time, so Khalid, I'm sure will be here to continue the conversation. I think we have a lot to work with. So thank you very much, Khalid, for these wonderful ideas and giving us at least the challenge to counter Islamophobia and look more critically from within, and not with apologetics, but with real critical information. Thank you.
Just about spiritualism. All I do in the Usuli Institute is I talk about Aqidah and developing our relationship with Allah. So I don't ignore that at all. It is the beginning and the end. It is everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.